So good afternoon again to 9/11 Day and MLK grantees, My Good Deed, Youth Service America, George Washington University Nashman Center for Civic Engagement, and my colleagues. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar focused on engaging in service during the time of COVID-19. We know that since about mid-March, many of our grantees and community partners have had to alter and rethink how their plans for service and working with volunteers, as well as their clients due to this pandemic. Today, My Good Deed, Youth Service America, and George Washington University Nashman Center for Civic Engagement will present to you what they have done so far in response to the pandemic and give you ideas on what you can do. Before handing it off to my colleague, Sharon Tendai, who will introduce our presenters, note that this webinar is being recorded and that we will reserve time at the end for questions and answers. And with that, Sharon, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Again, this is Sharon Tendai, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. On the call, we'll have David Payne and Jay Winnick from My Good Deed and 911day.org. We'll also have Amy Cohen and Emily Samus from the George Washington University Nashman Center. And last, we'll have YSA, which stands for Youth Service America. We'll have Michael Minks and Karen Daniel. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to David to get us started.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is David Payne, and I'm the, as you know, the president and co-founder of the 9/11 Day of Service and the organization that helped create it called My Good Deed. And My Good Deed, of course, was created by the 9/11 community back in 2002, ultimately with the goal of just establishing 9/11 as a day of service and transforming it from a day of tragedy into a day of doing good. You know, we wanted to just take it back from the terrorists. And as we have been doing for the last few years, of course, we have been organizing large-scale volunteer service projects, physical volunteer projects in cities all around the country. And as of February of this year, we were in the process of ramping up to stage large-scale projects in as many as 14 cities. In which thousands of volunteers were going to come together to pack meals for people in need. And ultimately, because of COVID, we've had to pivot and change our program, and unfortunately will not be able to put on these physical projects around the country this year. But I did want to be able to at least share with you sort of our plans and our strategies for other activities. So I'll talk a little bit about the at-home program and then so how you can participate, because it's not just meant for individuals, it's actually very much meant for organizations as well as employers, nonprofits, schools, faith groups, municipalities, government entities. It's really all about all of us participating together in this sort of 9/11 Day at-home program. And so we'd like to talk to you a little bit about how you can align and access toolkits and participate, and then talk generally about some of the COVID-19 strategies that we're thinking about, what we've learned, particularly over the last few months as we've been working with our program partners to evaluate whether we could even do meal packs. And so we wanted to share some of that, some of those thoughts with you on our end. And then, of course, we're going to then turn it over to our great friends at George Washington University and YSA that are going to share their specific case studies, ways they're dealing with the pandemic and adapting and pivoting just the way we have. And we'll finish that up with a question and answer session. So you can move to the next slide. Thank you. Let me tell you a little bit about what 9/11 Day at Home is. Well, if you know anything about our organization, you know that 9/11 has always been 9/11 Day has always been somewhat of a virtual volunteering experience, because we have over 30 million people that get out and observe the day, and they do that through what we call good deed doing. So that's lots of things that they might do on their own with their families, ways they might support local charities, and so it's very much self-directed in nature. And for the COVID pandemic environment, we basically are just sort of tapping into what that DNA is all about. And our goal is ultimately to try to launch the largest day of virtual volunteering ever in observance of this September 11th anniversary. working with more than 3,000 major corporations, as well as thousands of nonprofits and schools and other organizations, where they can participate and ultimately have 9/11 Day perhaps even benefit that. I mean, this is a difficult time for a lot of nonprofit organizations. It has been for us, and I think it has been for many others. And with the approaching Day of Service coming up, it's really an opportunity for you to reach out to your donors, to your supporters, and to your friends, and to encourage them to help and support your program and your activities. So we want you to think of 9/11 Day this year a little bit like Giving Tuesday, which is, it's your moment really to get out and talk about what you need, the help that you're looking for, and to inspire them to participate and support you as part of the way they would engage in 9/11 and as part of the good deed that they might want to do. So beginning later this month, we'll begin rolling out toolkits that are custom designed for a variety of different groups. So we'll have, of course, a toolkit for nonprofits, groups, municipalities, and other organizations, clubs. We'll have a toolkit for youth organizations, for schools, for teachers, for parents, and we'll have a kit designed for employers, all of which are sort of intended to help teach you about how you can leverage 9/11 Day in a way that makes sense for you. We're going to start by providing and creating a page where if you're an organization, you can register and participate. That's important for us because we're going to provide a lot of supporting materials, turnkey information, good deed suggestions and lists, and all sorts of really helpful information. And so this is just simply a way for you to get on that list so that we can distribute those materials to you. It doesn't cost you anything to participate, and we're certainly not going to spam you or, of course, sell any of your information. So in very short order, probably within about 2 weeks, that registration page will go live. But what I would suggest in the interim, to give you all a head start, go ahead and send us an email at info@911day.org, and we'll send you the draft toolkit, which should be ready by the end of this week. So we can give you a little bit of a running head start. And the important part of this program is for you to think about how you can sort of reach out to your own members and invite them to participate by doing good deeds on 9/11. And while you can certainly direct them to our site, where we will have a really great list of easy to do, digitally driven, virtual good deeds and service activities that are going to span a wide array of different types of causes and issues. And I'll talk about that in a minute. What I think would be most valuable for many of you would be to think about how you could build your own sort of list of 11 good deeds. That's the number we're using. And have those 11 good deeds be designed to relate specifically to your cause or your interest, so that you can essentially customize 9/11 Day at Home to be the vehicle by which your audiences get involved in supporting what you want to try to do. So you can move to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah. I just want to briefly touch on some of the things that we have certainly learned about our current environment. In the process of deciding what we wanted to do, particularly with our physical volunteer projects, we initially started with the idea that perhaps we could pull off a physical volunteering project. And in most cases, the meal pack projects that we do put on involve over 1,000 people that come together and pack meals over the course of the day. And so at any one time, we might have anywhere from 200 to 400 people also grouped together. Well, we of course knew that wasn't possible, but then in working with the health department, working with food banks, we ultimately designed a sort of a structure in which we might be able to engage perhaps 50 people, 75 people instead of 300, and do it in a socially distanced way. And I think we felt that we might be able to achieve that, but I will just kind of caution you, if you're still thinking about physical volunteer projects, what we encountered as we got closer and closer to needing to make a final decision. And when we sat down with our local partners and the volunteers who were actually going to staff the event, there was just a lot of anxiety and concern about whether or not they would be safe. And even though, we had laid it out in great detail how we were going to socially distance people, how we were going to monitor people, temperature check people, obviously use PPEs, the works. There was just natural stress and anxiety among our volunteer team leaders in some of the cities where we were going to put the event on. And we just concluded that with the rising number of cases, the fact that the way in which people can get exposed to COVID is still somewhat unknown. I mean, there was literally a study just the other day that talked about the possibility that it can and is being distributed through air conditioning. We just got to a place where we determined that, at least for us, where we had to do inside events. We couldn't do them outdoors because our events were food related. We just couldn't proceed. So I think if you're going to go forward with something that is physical, besides obviously covering off on every single possible form of social distancing and protection mechanisms, you want to do them outside, of course. And I would also encourage you to monitor the changing local state restrictions. We would have, a situation where in half of our cities, we were in perfectly good shape with the state and the city, and the next day we weren't. And so we kind of just concluded that with the ever-changing and unpredictable nature of group restrictions, doing physical projects, even of 10 or 20 people, would be tough. I would say that a lot of what we learned that was helpful in designing it came from food banks and volunteer centers, which have been doing a lot of effective social distancing, physical volunteer projects for many, many months now, since March. And so if you're going to be looking for best practices, I think they're great partners to talk to. But I think overall, I would be very careful about it. And to the degree that you can, and I think you're going to hear this from YSA and others, focus on as much as you can on virtual engagement as possible. Under the at-home program, we're going to be zeroing in on a number of areas that we think are particularly important in the COVID environment. Hunger is the obvious one that everyone talks about, but there has been significant negative impacts associated with homelessness, with mental health, with domestic violence, with veterans, obviously the importance of talking about anti-racism. And so we've sort of been able to curate what we think are about 8 or 9 critical areas of great and significant concern. And I would strongly encourage you to take a look at and research the impact that COVID is having on some of these areas, because it is significant. The forecasted number of suicides, for example, that could potentially double or even triple, depending on how far or how long the COVID recovery effort continues. These are things that are significant. So to the degree that you can align around some of the issues that are most pronounced, I think it's a good idea. So go ahead, feel free to move to the next slide. Thank you. With that, I'd just like to turn it over to our great partners at George Washington University and Youth Service America to have them kind of walk you through what their experiences are. And again, don't forget to send me an email at info@911day, and I'll get you the draft toolkit right away and answer any other questions you might have about the at-home program and how it can help you. Emily?
Great. Thank you so much, David. It's always nice to hear your voice. I think we will each introduce ourselves as we go through. So I'm Amy Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Honey W. Nashman Center for Civic Engagement and Public Service at George Washington University. And you can move to the next slide. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. This is just a little bit about us, and then I'll talk a little bit about the projects that we've been doing in partnership with 911day.org. So the Honey Nashman Center at GW is really the central office at our university for all things community service and civic engagement. What you see on the screen is our mission statement. We are about developing equity and active citizenship in our diverse democracy, meeting community needs through reciprocal partnerships beyond our campus, and enhancing teaching, learning, and scholarship at GW. We do see ourselves as primarily an office that provides service off campus. While there are many important activities that go on campus, things like food banks for students or food pantries for students, we primarily work with our partners in the District of Columbia. And you can go to the next slide. We do this through a variety of different kinds of strategies, and we have had to really reinvent all of these strategies under COVID-19 and under our current pandemic conditions. So we are a relatively small office. We have about 11 full-time staff, and we do immersion service or service events. So we do big days of service. We do the 9/11 Day of Service, of course, and we also do a large-scale Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service. We focus our students on long-term co-curricular community service. We have a social innovation hub as part of our work. And then, of course, we work with faculty to make service a part of what they do. We believe that in order to change the way the university functions, we need to change the way the academic part of the university functions. So we have about 70 courses and a lot of research projects. And we also host our own community programs, which I'll talk about in a little bit, in partnership with DC Public Schools, as well as in community organizations in Ward 8 here in DC. And then we provide a variety of other kinds of support for that kind of work. And we can move on to the next slide. As a large-scale center and as an organization that's been involved with 9/11 Days since 2009, we have been in close partnership with 9/11 Day. And we hosted, Emily Samos and I hosted a series of K-12 and higher education roundtables with 911day.org to talk to education organizations about how they are changing over in this new era. So we hosted several, I think it was 4 online conversations. We did some research to identify campuses and organizations that have already been doing this kind of work, and those that were interested in finding out more. And then we've done a fair number of conference presentations and have been looking at developing our education portfolio for 911day.org. And we were doing this both before COVID and in this time of COVID-19. We had, I think, 5 or 6 in-person conference presentations planned, which morphed into online conversations about how we can engage K-12 education institutions and higher ed institutions in service. So if we move to the next slide. And really, as we thought about reinventing, we needed to think, so the critical questions are, how can we rethink a day of service and rethink 9/11 Day of Service and engage students in individual or virtual service? As David was talking about, sort of 9/11 Day at home, thinking about how students can do things on their own. Or how can we as education institutions or community organizations organize effective virtual service opportunities for folks? And then as with all service, and these are the questions we always ask, is how do we make sure that limited duration service is significant and meaningful, that it is both meaningful for the recipients and meaningful for those who participate? And then finally, thinking through the process of reflection, because we know that when we do service, the way to make meaning from it comes through the reflective process, whether that is a highly formalized process of question and answer, or whether that is a kind of on-the-fly thought about how service worked. And certainly on 9/11 Day of Service, we have so many opportunities to reflect on the work that we do and the meaning of our service on this on the National Day. We can move on to the next one. So when we thought about how to make service meaningful, we really began to see this as an opportunity to think about service in a fuller way. Very often when we think about a day of service, we think about only the idea of direct service. We've been working, our partners at Stanford's Haas Center for Public Service has come up with this incredibly useful concept of pathways of public service and civic engagement. It's just a way of thinking about the kinds of service that we are already doing in our work. So you can see on the screen, we think about community engaged learning and research, which particularly in education institutions, it's how are we engaging the academic mission of the institution, having students do research with community. Direct service, policy and governance, participating within political processes, and they don't have to be big P political, but how students are participating in, for example, regulatory processes or understanding how decisions are made in their local community, community organizing and activism, philanthropy, and then social entrepreneurship and corporate social responsibility. So as we began to think about new ways to adapt our service, we really needed to go beyond a lot of the direct service that we normally have been doing and think about other pathways and other ways to get our students and partners engaged in service. So for example, under either community organizing or policy and governance, you could see a student writing an op-ed or a letter to the editor for their school newspaper or their local newspaper. It's another way of engaging in service and in participating in new ways. Let's move to the next slide. I wanted to talk just briefly about the ways in which GW has already begun to adapt its service programs. So we have a Jumpstart AmeriCorps program, which is a part-time early childhood AmeriCorps program. Our core members serve 300 hours and they are our students. Beginning in March, we were unable to go into early childhood classrooms, no surprise. But what we were able to do was to take our materials that we generally use with early childhood classrooms and have our core members make those materials on our site or in their dorm rooms. And then we delivered them to our program partners for distribution to families. We do that actually very often on days of service. We prepare Jumpstart materials with volunteers for our programs. So in this way, we were able to deliver the Jumpstart programming by delivering materials and then, where possible, going online with the families. Similarly, this summer, we have a VISTA program in partnership with DC Public Schools, and we have been able to go online with programming in a number of different ways. We have an early childhood program, different from Jumpstart, but where we are working with, I believe it's 47 different children to deliver and families to deliver books online, to read books online, to engage the children in activities online. Middle school tutoring, math, kind of standard math, reading, tutoring online. And then we've been working with high school students initially on SAT preparation, but when the SAT seemed to have been deep sixed across the board, we moved on to support advanced courses. In addition, we have an arts program. And again, what we did with that program was to adapt to an online environment. We mailed supplies home to students in those classes because we work with a population that doesn't necessarily have markers, pens, and crayons at home. So we were able to purchase and mail small-scale art kits to those students. But the other thing that we did was adapt and do studio tours. So we identified artists in the Ward 8 community and in the DC and Maryland community who are working artists. And so we held Instagram live tours through their studios and were able to educate students and our partners in that way. And finally, we've offered a program called Summer Trek Changemakers this summer, to middle schoolers here in DC, which is a civic education service learning program. 30 middle schoolers signed up to do 8 sessions of civic education, where they will identify and address a particular problem in the community, whether that's along 3 pathways: looking at COVID, looking at climate change, and looking at racism. And the middle schoolers will come up with a project that they're going to do by the end of July to address that area. So we really had to jump on a new way of doing things. And finally, one more thing. We, as I mentioned, do large-scale service days, and we will host again a welcome day of service this year at GW. Normally, that's 2,000 first-year students on 50 buses going to 50 sites across the region. And it simply isn't, we're not going to be able to set up classrooms, paint murals, and do all the things that we normally would. So this year we're adapting, and we'll be doing multiple days of service starting on 4 Saturdays, starting on August 28th. And a couple of those things will be in person. We'll be able to do some invasive species removal, i.e. weeding and trail development, because we can stay socially distant. But a lot of the other things that we've wanted to do, we simply can't. But what we have been able to do is to identify some online programs like the Smithsonian Transcription Service, which transcribes all of the objects at all of the Smithsonian museums, and the National Archives Citizen Archivist Project, which will also allow students to transcribe documents in the National Archives. And they can do those projects over time. So they'll get the project on one day, and then a week or 2 weeks later, we'll have to return that project to complete it. And it gives students an opportunity still to stay engaged, to reflect on the service in the context of 9/11 this year, and in the context of being newcomers to the District of Columbia. And yet it keeps them safe and socially distant from others. So I'm now going to turn this over to Emily to talk about some of the other ideas that we heard in our sessions.
Thanks, Amy, and you all can go to the next slide. Hi, everybody. This is Emily Samos, and I am a consultant working with Amy and working with organizations mostly in the DC area, but I have a really deep history with national service. I'll date myself, but I was in class 2 of AmeriCorps, so go way back to the early 90s when it all started. And so it's been really great to kind of be back working with Amy and working with David to think about how we can engage the higher education and K-12 audience in 9/11 Day, and especially looking forward to the 20th anniversary, as David talked about a little bit. And so also, as Amy mentioned, we were scheduled to go to several conferences. One was with NASPA, I'll talk about them in a minute, in Austin at the end of March. So clearly that did not happen. And so instead, we collaborated with them to host a few listening sessions. And then we also collaborated with YSA, Youth Service America, who you'll hear from in a minute, to host a brainstorming session with the K-12 and out of school time audience in mid-May, because we knew, these are folks that we'd already been in contact with about serving on 9/11 Day and serving in honor of 9/11. And we knew that they would have ideas and that they would bring things to the table. So those guiding questions that Amy talked about, we had our discussions focused on those questions. How can we rethink the day of service and engage students in individual or virtual service? What type of service is meaningful? How can we organize reflection? Again, the ideas that you see here on the screen, these are ideas that came from both that brainstorming session with the K-12 and OST audience, and that featured YSA talking about how they already did this with Global Youth Service Day, and I won't say much about that because you're going to get to hear directly from them. And so NASPA, for those of you who don't know, is the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. So it's essentially a huge membership organization of student affairs, higher education student affairs professionals. So they have a ton of ideas already, and they were basically already putting things in motion. So again, just a few ideas here that, you know, you can use 9/11 Day to launch a year-long commitment to service. So honor the day by getting students to kind of sign on to a year of service, and for them to start thinking about, just the way Amy just described, thinking about what are the issues that are most interesting to them, and what can they do, and how can they commit to a year of service. We also talked about focusing on a student's mental health. So sort of shifting the service to and building relationships and thinking about ways that you can bring people together to do that, which kind of goes into the next idea, which is create opportunities for connection and reflection. So that's both between students and between students and community partners. And obviously this would be all virtual. And then also, you know, thinking about David's idea, the 9/11 Day at home, but social media can be used, and this came up a lot in our calls. Students can connect on social media by posting pictures of themselves or sharing their ideas for service activities, sharing what they're doing, you know, sharing opportunities for each other. And then the idea of serving seniors, you know, kind of also what Amy talked about, that you can do the trail cleanup kind of at a distance, but you can also do a lot of stuff to serve seniors from a distance. You can do the letter writing campaign. They talked about doing virtual coffee meetings or virtual sort of sing-alongs, things like that, which is such a great idea. Creating lawn signs to kind of cheer up the seniors and just basically just dropping them off there. You can go on to the next slide. And then just a couple more ideas. The idea of doing virtual volunteer fairs. I thought this was a great idea. They talked about inviting community partners to, you know, a Zoom session like we're doing here. Have you know, breakout groups focused on issues, and then have the experts from the community-based nonprofit organizations speak to the students about the ways that they can get involved. So, you know, more of a sort of learning aspect of that, but then together they can brainstorm ways that they can actually do the service. Then also building off of what Amy just shared, supporting youth serving organizations. I know I have another project that I'm doing with Higher Achievement, which is a after-school program. They've already transitioned to virtual learning. They can absolutely use volunteers in that virtual setting. They absolutely need, you know, experts who can help the students with their academic learning, with their enrichment. They have they have, you know, long-term mentoring opportunities as well. All of that can still be done, you know, social distanced in a social distance way. And then also again, building on the ideas that Amy mentioned, conducting community needs assessment is something that can be done virtually, that is highly needed, and it can help inform future projects, and hopefully someday when we don't need to socially distance anymore. And then also, as Amy mentioned, doing the transcription and other types of virtual admin support for community organizations. All community organizations need that kind of support. So there's plenty of ways to still be involved in service while we need to socially distance, stay socially distant or physically distant, and many ways that you can be involved and do service virtually and still connect with each other around that service too. And so now I'm really excited to turn it over to my great colleagues at Youth Service America, because again, they've already done this. They've already had a Global Youth Service Day early on in the pandemic, and already had plenty of youth involved in that. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Karen and Mike.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to CNCS for hosting us today. I'm Karen Daniel. I'm the Vice President of Programs at YSA, and I'm here with my colleague, Mike Minks. He and I will be telling you a little bit about kind of what we started to learn through Global Youth Service Day, as Emily said. I know that we have many of our great partners on the phone. If you're not familiar with YSA, we are a 33-year-old nonprofit organization that is dedicated to engaging young people ages 5 to 25 in finding their voice and taking action and having impact through service in their communities. Our signature event is Global Youth Service Day, which happens every April. And so when COVID started shutting things down in March, we found ourselves having to pivot very quickly in terms of helping people to figure out how they would continue to do their service project in a very different environment. What you see here on the first slide on your screen is our website at the top of the screen, which we have dedicated to kind of all things related to resources and project ideas that can be done in the current environment. The graphic you see here represents 20 different issue areas. And when we started thinking about this in the very first week, the first thing we did was really think about kind of specific issues that were coming up in communities that were either arising for the first time or being made worse because of COVID, and how young people could address those issues through service. We started with 10 issue areas. We're now up to 20, which are represented in this graphic. And on this page, you'll see links to each of these 20 areas, including links to different partners of ours that are kind of specializing in those areas. We break down project ideas kind of from the simple to the advanced, projects that are appropriate for different age kids, kind of from the younger to the older end of the spectrum. We organize them by through the IPARTSI steps of the service learning process, so that people can find links kind of for each stage of the planning process that they're working on. And we've also linked them to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, because that's a big way that we organize helping people think about the issues that they'll address. If you go to the next slide. This is a graphic that represents some surveying that we did of the field and our various partners at the national, state, and local level early on about how they were responding to the coronavirus crisis. So you'll see here some early information that we got that we really used to kind of start tailoring the resources that we were able to provide. You'll see here at the top the ASAP acronym. YSA uses this acronym both as kind of a play on the fact that we need young people ASAP to solve problems in their communities. We don't want to wait for them to grow up and turn 18 in order to be active. But we also use it as an acronym for the 4 ways that youth can make a difference through awareness building, service, advocacy, and philanthropy. So that's where the ASAP comes in here. You'll also see in the lower left corner a breakdown of different things that people reported doing in their communities, as well as kind of that broken out by the SDGs, the global goals that I mentioned. If you go to the next slide. And now I will pass it to my colleague, Mike Minks.
Great, thanks, Karen. So focusing on meeting some of the immediate needs that are a result of the pandemic was really the first strategy. The second strategy that we took was really to figure out how to adapt the types of activities that we were already suggesting people do on days of service. And over the last year or two, we have moved in the direction of promoting a lot of different types of activities in addition to the direct service project. And so a lot of the things that you see here are pretty similar to some of the ideas that Amy and Emily were talking about as well, around really that pledge process, or getting people committed to or recruited to volunteer in the longer term on days. Really looking at days as a time to recognize and celebrate volunteers. We obviously know that that thanking process and that recognition process is one of the biggest factors in volunteers returning and continuing to serve with your organization. Looking at voting and civic engagement, and especially this year, thinking that 9/11 will be just 2 months before the election. And obviously, as Sarah noted in the comments, that federal funds are not allowed to be used for voter registration or really any kind of political election activity. So make sure that if you are doing that, you are not using any CNCS funds for that, and that's a separate part of your work. But we obviously think is a key part of the civic engagement kind of ecosystem. Looking at recruiting and expanding membership in programs, doing trainings, building partnerships, and having community conversations and community asset mapping and needs assessments. And so again, a lot of the same types of things that Amy and Emily were talking about. And this really worked well because a lot of these things were a lot easier to turn virtual. than a lot of the direct service projects were. And so on the right side, you'll see what we pulled out for the last minute planners to adapt around Global Youth Service Day. And the great part was that all of these things were already on the site. We were able to just kind of pull out the specific ideas and strategies that really lend themselves to go virtual much more easily than direct service projects. So on the next slide, you'll see some tips that we've collected from our grantees. We work with what we call lead agencies that work citywide or statewide around 3 days of service, 9/11, MLK Day, and Global Youth Service Day. And we've really collected these tips that you'll see for each of the strategies that we'll be sharing with you. And the first was really, making sure that you're using the technology platforms that people are already familiar with, especially if you're working with students. They've had to go through this with, as part of their distance learning, and so they're familiar with this, and to not recreate the wheel, that all of these tools are out there, and there's great tips on how to use them. Always remembering to kind of turn over to young people to plan and facilitate wherever possible. We know that's always a challenge for the adult facilitators, and I think becomes a little bit harder because as we all feel, we kind of need to be in control of this new process. But believe me, young people will figure out how to talk to each other and work together and plan if you give them the challenge to do so. As Amy mentioned, the reflection is really a key part of the process, and a lot of what's come out of working with educators is the need to really do individual check-ins in addition to group sessions. That it's really easy to kind of get lost, for individuals to get lost when you're one of 20 boxes on a screen and not in person. So taking that time for the project leaders or facilitators to check in with the individual people who are helping plan the activities, and making sure that planning and that reflection process is as inclusive as possible. And then the last tip on this is again to pay attention to any issues around access to technology. We obviously saw that with distance learning challenges of families not having access to to computers or to tablets or to internet access. And again, most schools and communities have tackled that in various ways. And so just that you pay attention to that as well, and to use, again, the school systems and libraries and other community resources around that that have been provided to families to help your volunteers and project organizers connect to those resources so that access isn't an issue. So that was really the second strategy we took, was around how you take our kind of typical group activities and do them virtually. But we also thought about how you do much more individual activities since we're all at home, which when we move to the next slide, Karen is going to pick back up.
Thanks, Mike. So like Mike said, we started thinking about how to make it easier for young people and their families to do projects from home. For several years, we have had a great funding partner in Hasbro, and they also work with an organization called Design for Change, which created a really neat challenge that you see here called the #DoGoodFromHome challenge. We thought this was a great opportunity to encourage people to participate in. And what happens is people go ahead and do their projects that they had planned. They post it to social media, on our registration page for Global Youth Service Day, or kind of wherever it might be appropriate. They #DoGoodFromHome. As a part of this, Hasbro has committed that for each project that uses this hashtag, they will donate a toy or a game to an organization that is providing care for essential workers, children. They've committed up to 25,000 toys and games And we're about halfway there. So we think that there's a lot of momentum through the summer, and going into 9/11 could just be the thing that gets us to 25,000. So would love to have you all weave that into what you're planning. And we found that volunteers have found this to be very meaningful in terms of knowing that their project kind of has this a double impact, not just the project itself, but the additional donation that's coming through Hasbro. If you go to the next slide. This is a link to YSA's ideas database on our campaign website that you see here at the top. We have created a database of project ideas that people can search by what we call their spark, or the thing that they love to do, their passion, as well as the issue that they're interested in addressing. And we added a filter to this database for projects that could be easily done from home. So you'll see some samples here. And what we found kind of across all of our work is that while YSA never tells young people what issue they should be addressing, we want them to kind of see what they're passionate about and what the needs are in their community. Sometimes it's helpful to have a starting idea, and then people can be inspired and adapt. So these project ideas are really designed with that strategy in mind. If you go to the next slide, and actually I think the next slide is a duplicate, so the next slide, thanks. We have, again, some tips in terms of things that people have found useful around individual and family at-home activities. The first is the idea of kind of what we call a project in a box, really kind of a kit that can be dropped off or mailed, that really kind of contains everything in it that a family would need to participate. Guides for adult facilitators, including parents and other youth leaders, have been really helpful in terms of kind of making a project flow smoothly. We've looked at smaller versions of a larger event. We've looked at kind of organizing friendly competitions between neighbors or groups of families or even schools that can be done from home. And we've also looked at incentives, kind of local versions of the Do Good From Home Challenge that I shared with you earlier, where proceeds can be going to local charities or organizations. So that's kind of some of the things that we've compiled around the at-home strategy, and then I'll turn it back to Mike for the last section.
Thanks, Karen. And the fourth piece that we really thought about starting on the next slide is how you do adapt and still do some in-person projects. And we certainly didn't see a whole lot of this on Global Youth Service Day since we were still very early on. But we think as we all learn to live with this over the next several months, that some versions of in-person projects and activities will be a little bit more common. As David mentioned early on, really looking at outdoor projects are preferred. So there's lots gardenings and cleanups and so many projects that are outdoors anyway that can hopefully continue. Obviously may not be the best option in January for MLK Day, but hopefully we all have fairly good weather in early September to let outdoor projects happen on 9/11. If you do do indoor projects, making sure it's in a large enough space and with good ventilation and airflow, pretty much we would recommend against that. But if that's the only option for you, certainly there are ways to do that and to make it safe or safer. Looking at multiple shifts, smaller groups, limited period of time, breaking apart tasks, different parts of the project, with for example, a gardening project, you might have some people, one group prepare the garden and do the digging, and one group do the planting, and one group do the mulching and clean up. You can and instead of having 100 people there all for 1 hour kind of doing all of those things, that you can do 25 people an hour each over the course of 3 or 4 hours and break things apart, and you could do kind of that similar breakout with with a lot of different project types. Obviously, and this doubles some of the piece on the next slide, which we can move to. But maintaining social distancing and all those safe behaviors, wearing masks and gloves and not sharing supplies and putting markers to help people keep their distance. All of those things. Obviously that adds another part to the planning process and another step you have to prepare for. And so to make sure that you're thinking about that early enough on to include in your budget and your timeline and to order supplies. Some of them are maybe a little bit difficult to get, so you need a little, to order enough ahead of time. Making sure that you have folks signing in and that you're collecting that contact information. Hopefully everything is safe and that there are no issues, but again, with that contact tracing process with local health officials, that if you did have a volunteer that was infected, having that contact information for everyone who participated would be crucial to help provide to local public health folks. One idea that we heard was instead of kind of doing the kind of a reminder or a lecture on the safe behaviors that you're expecting of volunteers, that you have volunteers at the beginning when they sign in or do orientation to take a safety pledge, to really make sure they recognize the things that they're supposed to do. And back to the having different slots, obviously we think it's a great opportunity to encourage families to volunteer together, since you can have slightly higher numbers be together close to each other if they're family. So that families give you a little bit more flexibility than all individual volunteers who are there on your own. The next slide really promotes the idea that that each of these 4 strategies that we've shared aren't necessarily exclusive. A lot of our grantees and partners are doing a combination of things, right, where they're doing all of their planning and preparation virtually, or their outreach and promotion virtually, and then doing limited in-person or at-home projects, phasing out the different steps of the process. Between at home and in person, and virtual things done as a group on Zoom or other platforms. So you can kind of mix and match between a lot of these different strategies in what works best for you and your community. And some other ideas around these hybrid approaches on the next slide, around if you do this hybrid option, even providing two options, that how you can participate in a project at home, but if you do feel comfortable showing up in person, what you can do, and really leaving that up to, the comfort level of the volunteers, and let them make that decision, for themselves around what they feel safe doing with all of the precautions that you're taking. Looking at virtual showcases or celebrations of those individual or at-home activities. Projects. We saw that again come out of a lot of the work around distance learning, that all the students were working on projects, but that kind of that wrapping up and sharing with each other was critical. And then one idea that we really liked of working with local media or community television to broadcast or live stream events or how-to segments on these things to let more folks in your community participate. When they have that information. So that was the kind of 4th strategy around how to adapt some in-person projects. And then to wrap up our work, turn it back to Karen to talk about some of the specific 9/11 day resources that we've developed with our CNCS funding over the years.
Thanks, Mike. On the next slide, you'll see the website for our 9/11 Day campaign page, which has all of our kind of resources and links related to 9/11, including several of them that we've talked about here. We also have links to several of our great partners, including David and his team's resources at 9/11 Day and CNCS's resources that you'll find here on this page. On the next slide, you'll see some YSA's kind of main resources that we encourage people to use across projects, not just for 9/11 Day. These resources are all free of charge and can be downloaded from our site. The Youth Changing the World Toolkit is our main project planning resource, which has kind of everything that, all the nuts and bolts from A to Z of planning and implementing a project. The Kids in Action Guide is like the Youth Changing the World Guide, but for younger children specifically. The Semester of Service Toolkit is for teachers for specific use in classrooms, and is designed to really help facilitate a project over a semester or a longer time period. We often encourage teachers and classrooms to kick off projects on the 9/11 Day of Service and continue through the fall semester, kind of concluding or wrapping up either with the holidays or on the MLK Day of Service. And then the Classrooms with a Cause document is maybe what you might call the Semester of Service Teacher Toolkit Lite, with a little bit less kind of service learning and academic content woven in, but really designed to kind of look at a demonstration project for helping students and classes take what they've learned and really put it into practice through a service project. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some of our 9/11 Day specific resources that we've created with support from CNCS. The first resource is really kind of 10 reflections about 9/11 Day and some projects that can be done kind of based around those reflections. So kind of a way to link the history and meaning of 9/11 Day to our current service focus. The We Stand Strong Toolkit is focused on disaster preparation and projects that can be done to support communities in that way. And the last two resources you see we did in partnership with CNCS and Scholastic to really focus on helping teachers and classrooms to plan 9/11 Day projects. So as I said, all of those resources are available on our website free of charge, and we'd love for you to use them. So that really wraps up YSA's content. So I'll turn it back to our organizers.
Hello again. To ask a question verbally, select the raise hand icon and you will be placed into a queue. When we are ready for your question, we will unmute you. A prompt will display, confirm that you want to be unmute, and then you can ask your question.
Thank you, Sabrina. So this is Sarah Fry, Day of Service Program Officer again. I'll be facilitating the Q&A. Just to recap, we already got just a couple of questions in the chat. So from Damian Martin, the question was, will they get a link to the recording of any of the material shared today? Yes, we will send out the link of the recording to you. Most likely, I'm guessing next week. It takes a few days for us to get the recording up. And then we had another question, I think more of a comment related to prohibited activities, and I put the link in the chat where you can see prohibited activities for CNCS grantees. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I see one from Jamie Phillips. Are there good places to get resources for adult volunteers? Do any of our presenters want to take that question on? David, Emily, Amy, Karen, or Mike?
And can maybe just clarify what they mean by resources? Would that mean specifically opportunities or just tips for them in terms of how they might volunteer? Because of course, for adult volunteers, there are just a wealth of places where they could potentially go. And Points of Light Volunteer Match, as Michael's pointing out in the chat, Idealist all have really good virtual volunteering opportunities. I would also suggest, though, that they start off by looking at some of their local community resources, like maybe their local volunteer center, hands-on affiliate there, because so many of them have, like all of us, had to convert to virtual engagement, and very, very early on, as early as March, a lot of them are, curating some really terrific ideas locally. I mean, it's inconsistent. It just depends on, which group, but I would definitely suggest that you start local and sort of work your way to national.
Thanks for sharing, David. Jamie, I feel like you answered your question. If not, please continue to type in the chat. Sabrina, you also said we had a raised hand. Do you want to unmute that person?
Oh, can I just also respond back from Jamie had a question about that she was looking for tips to connect volunteer service specifically to 9/11. So what we do is, so there are literally thousands of nonprofits that are posting 9/11 related opportunities in both a volunteer match and All for Good and some other applications like some of the United Way portals. And now a lot of them, I will tell you, are now, there's been such a significant change because traditional volunteering projects are not as readily available, but those databases can be good opportunities, and you can search by 9/11 and look for things that are specifically available within that opportunity. But one of the things to consider too is that with the 9/11 Day at Home program, a big part of this is inviting individuals like an adult or with a family to think about things they could do, in their own lives. For example, I have an 11-year-old, and so usually for 9/11, he goes through some of his clothing that he's not wearing anymore, that he's outgrown, or he has a bicycle that he doesn't ride, and there's opportunities where those items can be packaged up and donated, dropped off, and done so in a safe way. In communities that, I happen to live in California, but in colder communities, like New York, the New York Cares, for example, runs a really important coat drive that begins in the fall. And so there are a lot of self-directed ideas that adults can consider and develop on their own. They don't necessarily have to rely on outside resources to figure out how and what would be the best place for them to make an impact on 9/11.
Thanks, David. I'm also going to read from the chat a response to that same question. Peter said most United Ways institutes have volunteer opportunities for adults. Rhonda with CNCS says that there's going to be further messaging out soon about how adult volunteers can connect to 9/11. I don't think I'm missing anything on that particular thread. Emily Samuel says adults can certainly serve as tutors, mentors, and project leaders for 9/11 Day. Damian says at the mission continues, we're connecting veterans with under-resourced communities across the country with virtual and in-person service projects that are open to all ages. Sorry, to scroll down a little further. Amy also put a link in where they're posting opportunities for people to connect to. I see that the person who had raised their hand has since put their hand down, so we don't have a question through that portal. Any other questions? You can please put them in the chat or raise your hand. And Rhonda is also pointing out CNCS will have a link on our website for volunteer opportunities as well. Hey, Rhonda, since there aren't any other questions coming in, I noticed that you put in the chat our CNCS webpage that already has 10 ways that people can volunteer, not just for 9/11, but across the country now in COVID-19. Did you want to share that or talk a little bit more about that while we're waiting for other questions to come in?
Surely. If you go to our homepage, you'll find the link to our COVID resources, and there are 10 sort of basic ways from giving blood to supporting hunger and those sorts of things, with a list of links to hook up to. I would also recommend that at the time of year it is, there are also a lot often disaster preparedness activities that are happening, and FEMA has ready.gov. There are lots and lots and lots of ideas about how you can be prepared for a disaster in your own home, and how to prepare for being your own first responder. I know everyone's really worried about that sort of stuff as we approach, hurricane season and the potential for fires and flooding and all those things that are ever present, especially in those in the minds of those who live in areas that are prone to those kinds of natural disasters.
Thanks, Rhonda. Emily Samos, one of our presenters from George Washington University Nashman Center for Civic Engagement, has a question to our audience today. She said, what were you hoping to learn from this webinar? Did we cover what you were expecting? What more ideas do you have? And I'll add to that, say, what other resources do you think would be helpful? Please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, we'll see if we get any answers to that. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, perfect. This is Damien with Michigan Continues. And I just wanted to, I really appreciate that question because it made me think, well, I don't know, did we cover everything? Is there other things to ask? It's more of a comment question. I think, especially for being in the veteran nonprofit space, we have been great pre-COVID of being collaborative and working well together. And we found ourselves challenged to be competitive in a way because of funding and a lot of shared partners, and we're just really trying to focus on how do we remain collaborative and not get competitive for funding and dollars, and truly, stay focused on the work and the support that we provide to communities. So if y'all have any thoughts or ideas around that, that'd be great. It might be an unspoken challenge a lot of people are facing. I just know we've been facing a lot over the past few weeks.
Well, thanks for sharing, Damien. We'll brainstorm more on that. Did any of the presenters want to respond to that, or Rhonda or Sharon, my colleagues?
Well, this is Rhonda. I can only imagine the competition for resources right now, but I think that you have to face those conversations head on with your partners, that you're all working toward a common goal, and that at the end of the day, our communities will be better if we work together and eliminate as much competition as we can. As I said, I can only imagine how difficult resource acquisition is at this particular moment.
This is Emily. I was going to say the same thing pretty much, that it's as much as possible, and I know you all know this, so I'm just kind of reiterating what you already know, but partnering on grant applications and almost saying like it's all or all of us or none of us kind of thing, but then also partnering with funders so that it's about those long-term relationships and that you're all in it together. Exactly what Rhonda said, that it's about kind of leveraging each other's assets, kind of merging resources, and then being a stronger together as a funding opportunity, as a inviting thing for a funder to invest in.
I would also suggest that in communities where you have potential sources of funding in the business community, having conversations about engaging their employees in your service activities. I mean, there are probably funds available to help support that still. They're all worried about some of those same issues of keeping their employees engaged in community and feeling good about their work writ large, both at work and in the community. So I would also think about that. I happened to sit in on part of a webinar yesterday where funders were actually talking about this is not the time to really cut back if we can at all afford it, that it's really important to keep dollars flowing to organizations so that they survive. So I think it probably just means more phone calls and more outreach, but at least the folks on that call, that webinar yesterday, were really pushing the time is now to keep funding.
Well, thanks, Rhonda. It looks like Amy and Scott have been having a little bit of a back and forth here in the chat regarding virtual opportunities in courts, I believe. And Amy is asking Scott, one of our audience members, do you have a training on how to manage difficult dialogues, others on difficult conversations? I would be interested in learning more or less on the court part and more on the getting along, hold on, I'm scrolling down here, and getting along through dispute part. I will email offline. Scott, I can connect you guys, but I don't know if you're able to unmute yourself. Maybe you could respond now in case others are interested. If not, I'll connect you guys afterwards.
You know, we have, this is Rhonda again, we have in past listed our Day of Service grantees on our website. If each of you have something particular you would like linked in that list, if you could send it to me, rtaylor@cns.gov by Monday, we'll work on getting that up so that folks can access your resources as a grantee. You know, we don't want to recreate the wheel, and if people are looking for something and you've got it, it would certainly be nice to direct folks to your resources for days of service.
Okay, Rhonda, I think the next question is for you. Will any of the new branding for CNCS be out so that we can brand 9/11 correctly? I think they're referring to the nationalservice.gov 9/11 website we have.
Yeah, I'm not sure when all the new branding is going to be live. I wouldn't expect it in time to do a promotion for 9/11, but we are very interested in all being on the same page for social media and branding, and not a lot of disparate identity out there. So soon, I hope, but not our new brand.
Thanks, Rhonda. Looks like Scott tried unmuting, but it didn't work. I'm sorry, Scott. I'll connect you guys afterwards. Any other questions? I'll give it another minute. Please feel free to raise your hand. Sabrina, do we have any raised hands?
At this time, we do not have any more raised hands.
Thank you, Sabrina. Rhonda, would you like to give your closing remarks before we end? And did you also still want to try having a chat with the 9/11 Day grantees conducting service this September, or would you rather wait till a future time to do that?
If we could do that for just 2 minutes after. Thank you everyone for joining the call. Thank you to our presenters who really gave some excellent tips and ideas. We know that all of you will have your own to share, and we look forward to being able to share those with others on the call and with others in the service community. And more than anything, we look forward to hearing about what you're going to be doing and your accomplishments this fall. This is a big year leading up to the 20th anniversary next year. And so even though this is going to be a very unusual year for everyone, I think it's important to show how serious and involved and important it is to honor this Day of Service and Remembrance and continue to be resilient and move forward. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to future conversations and getting you more marketing materials probably about a month out.
Thank you, Rhonda, and David, Emily, Amy, Karen, and Michael. I believe Rhonda wanted to try to hold back our current FY19 9/11 Day of Service grantees who will be conducting service this upcoming September. So if you are on the line and you're with Durant, Reed 60 Buffalo College,